Good evening, everybody. It is an absolutely gorgeous evening here in Annapolis, and I hope that you are enjoying yourselves. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. We are excited to bring this lecture to you tonight. I'm Janet Hall, Visitor Services Director for Historic Annapolis, and on behalf of our entire team, our Board of Trustees, our President and CEO, Karen Brown, our staff, our members, and our wonderful volunteers, to all of you out there in the virtual world, thank you for joining us this evening. Tonight, we're going to be time traveling a bit. Now, you know that we are normally in the period of the Revolutionary War, but we're going to go to World War II this evening. And it's an exciting thing that Annapolis and Historic Annapolis has expanded its reach. All of that's primarily due to the Museum of Historic Annapolis at 99 Main Street, where we cover multiple generations of Annapolitans and history. This evening, we're going to be learning about the Native American Code Talkers, and our presenter is Greg Nedved. Greg recently just retired from as a historian at the Cryptologic Museum, and we welcome him back to our series. First, a little bit about HA, if you don't know, and about some of our upcoming events. HA's mission is to preserve, protect, and to connect, and we've been doing that with the public and with our community since 1952. This series has been a way for us to broaden that reach, to reach out beyond the boundaries of Annapolis and even Maryland. So those of you from other places, thank you for promoting us. We have a nice following with the New York Historical Society, as a matter of fact. Our foundation is based on our membership. If you haven't become a member, please consider doing so. There are many different levels where you can contribute. It's a great cause, and we are very impactful, and we appreciate it. So go to our website and look to see where you might fit in. Thank you to those who also supporting our education programs. This outreach with field trips, programs, group tours, publics, and our fundraising events, all of it is part of our outreach, and it does reach the community. My thanks always to this HA team, my fellow co-workers. Sarah Butters is behind the controls tonight. If we have any IT issues, which, crossing our fingers, we've had a few, she'll be there, as well as Kara Garside and Kaylin Bedsworth. Just a few updates. So, the Museum of Historic Annapolis is open. It is open on Thursdays, Fridays, Saturdays, Sundays, and Mondays. It's closed Tuesday and Wednesdays. So come on down to 99 Main Street, go through it, take a complimentary 30-minute tour, and enjoy it. The glorious garden that is behind me is coming into bloom. If you love gardening, if you love history, this is a perfect combination. It is the year of the garden that we are celebrating, and we would love for you to come. The William Pega House and Garden are ready, and we come take a tour with one of our very, very knowledgeable docents. So what else is going on? Our next virtual lecture is going to be May 7th. If you haven't registered yet, please do. You're going to be hearing Dr. Glenn F. Williams, who is a retired Army officer. He entered public history as a second career. He is an amazing researcher, a wonderful author, and if you have attended some of his lectures, nobody knows battles or anything more than him. And that's from Rick Bell. It is Lord Dunmore's War, the last conflict of America's colonial era. So join us for that. Other in-person programs are ongoing. A whole list of them are available on our website under our calendar of events. There are programs like Mr. Pega's Garden Storytime this coming Saturday. There is a culinary herb workshop that is sponsored by Homestead Gardens. Join us for that on Sunday, and lots more. Saturday, April 27th in person from 12 to 2 p.m. at the William Pega House and Garden. You can join us for 8 coats, 7 shirts, 15 fathom wampum, early colonial settlement, and the first deeds. Stop by the William Pega House to meet living historian Drew Shuptar Ravis and learn about the indigenous peoples who inhabited this area of the Chesapeake Bay. Right now, I'd like to introduce you to our speaker this evening. Gregory J. Nedved is recently retired as a historian at the Center of Cryptologic History. As I mentioned, he'd been there from 2011 to 2024. His specialty is in China. Prior to this, he had spent much of his professional career, both military and government, working with the Chinese language in various capacities as an analyst, a translator, and instructor as well. He's got a BA degree from St. Vincent College and an MA from the Hawaii Pacific University. He is also a graduate of the Naval War College Fleet Seminar Program and has a certificate in advanced translation Chinese from the University of Chicago. He is a two-time winner of NSA's Cryptologic Literature Award and is the author of many books, periodicals, and it is very great expert in topics as diverse as flags to presidential foreign language trivia. And I think we're going to need to get to that one sometime. He served as the president of the National Museum of Language in College Park and just retired, as I mentioned, from the NSA. He's also been a continuing education instructor at Anne Arundel Community College, both with basic Chinese language, history courses as well. He is the author, of the Presidential Foreign Language Trivia book. For more information about cryptology, excuse me, Greg, please visit, and he really does suggest you get to the National Cryptologic Museum and also the NSA history website too. Greg has been kind enough to present another lecture for us. His earlier program, which was really terrific and very interesting, was Cryptology in the Revolutionary War. We thank you, Greg, and for your support of HA and are appreciative of you sharing your time with us this evening. There you are.
Okay, thank you, Janet.
You're
I guess
welcome.
you
I
can
love
hear
your
me.
background.
Right, yeah, I'm not in Hawaii. I'm not in some Pacific island somewhere. I'm given this from good old Severna Park. Yeah, and I'm looking out my window, and it's not quite the same view, but it's not bad. The weather's really nice today.
It's
I want to
beautiful.
thank everyone for this opportunity to present. And I guess I want to go ahead and get started. So let me share the screen and we can go ahead and get started. I expect this presentation will take about an hour. We shall see. I'm sure there'll be questions. Okay. Okay, I trust that everyone can hear me, and if you can't, I'm sure I will hear about it very soon. All right, again, I'm Greg Nedved, and I'm a retired historian for the Center for Cryptologic History, which is the NSA History Office. And I want to thank Janet and the Historic Annapolis for this opportunity to talk about the Code Talkers, which is one of my favorite topics. You can tell by looking at the slide that this is a National Cryptologic Museum presentation. I am a volunteer down there. I have been for many years, and I expect to do so in my retirement. All right, I'm going to go on to the next slide. Okay, many of us are aware that the United States used Native American languages, especially Navajo, during World War II. And as far as we know, our adversaries, the Japanese, the Germans, the Italians, never understood what was being said by these code talkers. Now, that's true. I'm not here to tell you otherwise, but there are some misconceptions about what code talking actually is. I think people think that it's just people speaking in some language no one else knows. You know, the Navajo just speaking Navajo, the Arapaho just speaking Arapaho. Okay, there's a little bit more to it than that. Okay. Certainly they're talking in an obscure language, and there's some direct translation, but what they're actually doing is making up words, coded words that don't exist in their own language because they need it on the battlefield. And in some cases, they'll spell out words. And they also use English sometimes too, which I think would surprise some people. All right, there's various versions of code talking that's been used down through the years. It's actually been going on forever. And I think people would be surprised to learn that the United States was not the only country in World War II to do code talking. It was done by other countries as well. if you stop and think about it, this makes sense. Who was in World War II? The British, the Soviets. You know, the British Empire had a lot of languages. The Soviet Union had more languages than you can count. They certainly did the same thing. We know that in Burma, Welsh was used by the British. And we know, at least according to German records, that the Soviet Union used a number of languages against them. But the United States is really the only country that talks about their code talkers. And I'm glad we do, because we're giving representation to people who really deserve it. Okay, how many total code talkers were there? We don't have an actual number. The best number, the highest number I could find was 534. Okay, and the best source for this is the tribe, the reservation numbers, the reservations themselves provide these numbers. But these aren't exactly reliable. The reservations themselves don't always have the best records. They rely on things like newspaper clippings, you know, hearsay interviews with their own, you know, tribe people. This isn't necessarily as good as documentation. Historians love documentation. So you need to keep that in mind. Also, the Army, as we'll learn, did not document well their use of code talkers, unlike the Marines, who documented it very well. Okay, so you're looking in the screen at the Navajo, the most famous of the code talkers, and I'll spend a lot of time on them later on. But let's start off with an earlier war. Okay, let's start with World War I, which was the first time that we used code talking. The time period I'm talking about, World War I, is 1914 to 1918. The United States got involved in the war in 1917. And we would do a lot of the fighting beginning in 1918. We actually used code talking towards the end of World War I. All right, in World War I, we had very bad communication security. Whenever we tried to send a message out, the chances were really, really good that our adversaries, in this case, the Germans, would be able to read the messages. There's a story about a commander who wanted to test his own communication security. So he launched, or he planned a fake attack. He sent the message out, at a certain time, we're going to attack this hill. And when that time came, the Germans obliterated the hill. They knew in advance we were coming. So it's because of this, we were looking for better ways of protecting our communications. And that's how code talking was used. Now, for a long, long time, it was believed that the Choctaw, which will actually be my next slide, the Choctaw were the first code talkers in World War I. We now know that the Cherokee were earlier than the Choctaw. And to be a little bit more specific, it's the Eastern Band of Cherokee from North Carolina. Now, how did this come about? Well, again, it had to do with communication security. A Lieutenant John Stanley of the 30th Division saw that he had some Cherokee in his unit, and they were talking among themselves. And it occurred to him that if we got these guys to pass messages on the phone and the radio, the Germans aren't going to be able to understand it. So it was tried on October 8th, 1918, during the Somme Offensive, SOMME, for those of you that know about that particular offensive. Now, we don't know anything else about what happened. We only know that it was done on this one day. We don't know how many people were involved or what happened the next day. But this is the first recorded use of code talking by Native Americans in World War I, and it was done by the Cherokee. To be honest, or to be clear here, if you're looking at the screen, those are not Cherokee code talkers. They are Americans, and they are involved in communications work. We don't have a picture of the Cherokee code talkers. Now, that's not true with the Choctaw. We do have a picture of the Choctaw. And the Choctaw, as I said, were the best documented, the best known of World War I. The Choctaw Nation, southeastern United States, in this case, Oklahoma was where they came from. And again, the idea here was to improve our security. And this time it was a Captain Lawrence, not Lieutenant John Stanley. Captain Lawrence of the 36th Division, who overheard two of his men speaking in Choctaw. Again, let's get these guys on the radio. Let's get them on the phone and see if we can fool the Germans. And that's exactly what happened. October 26th, using Choctaw as a way of passing the message, these units withdrew successfully. It caught the Germans off guard. All of a sudden, these American units are withdrawing successfully. And the next day, October 27th, the Americans launched a surprise attack on the Germans. The message was put out in Choctaw. The Germans were caught completely off guard. And this is the Moise Argonne Forest campaign. Again, for those of you that are interested in that kind of stuff. So now the Germans were in retreat. This caught them off guard completely. How many code talkers were involved? We had from 8 to 18 of them. The numbers are not entirely clear. But this was such a successful operation that we decided we would continue it, except World War I came to an end. So the program just ended just like that. And again, these are Choctaw that are on the screen. Okay, I'm going to continue to talk a little bit more about the Choctaw because we know a fair amount about them. Okay. Their language was limited, which was true with a lot of the Native American tribes. What I mean by limited is that they didn't have a lot of words that you would need for the modern battlefield. So they were forced to make up words, and this is where the code talking comes in. And in all cases, and this means the other tribes as well, culture came into play. Concepts that they were very familiar with on the reservations, they brought into these terms. Here's just a couple of the terms that they came up with, codes that they invented. They didn't have a word for artillery, so they used big gun. What a surprise. Little gun shoot fast became machine gun. And I'll give you one more. And this is unfortunately reflective of the time period. Poison gas was used in World War I. It was actually used by our adversaries against us. And so the Choctaws called it bad air. So when they said bad air, they meant poison gas. So how do they communicate? Well, they use field phones, field telephones, and radio, but something else here too. And this, as far as we know, never happened in World War II at all. This is the only instance of this. What is this? They used written messages by way of courier. Choctaw was a written language enough where you could send messages written in Choctaw that could be understood. So that's pretty neat. All right, on to the next slide. All right, the Choctaw were supposed to get recognition, but it took a while. This isn't a surprise. In 1986, many years later, the Choctaw posthumously received the Choctaw Nation Medal of Valor, commemorating their contributions during World War I. And in 1989, 3 years later, and this is what you're seeing on the screen, France awarded them the Fifth Republic's Knight of the National Order of Merit, because the Choctaw, as were the Cherokee and the other code talkers in World War I, were primarily in France. All right, so let's go on to the next screen. In World War I, there were other tribes that made claims for code talking as well. The problem is that these are not well documented. There's newspaper articles and things like that, not much other evidence. I'm going to take these one by one. I've already done the Cherokee, I've done the Choctaw, but I will mention Comanche, and I'll talk more about Comanche in World War II. According to an Oklahoma City newspaper, a Comanche was awarded by the Belgian government for code talking. And that appears to be all the evidence we have. No records back that up. There were 2 Cheyenne who were trainers of the Choctaw, but neither one of them deployed. Okay, Lakota and Sioux, I need to clarify this. Lakota is a dialect of Sioux. There's really 3 dialects of Sioux: Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota, like North and South Dakota. So I don't know when they say Sioux here if they're referring to the other 2 dialects. But the documentation for the use of Lakota and or Sioux in World War I is not very strong. It's much stronger in World War II. Okay, Osage. I want to talk about Osage. The Osage claim one code talker. Other sources say two. But the one person that they claim did not go overseas, according to his own records. And then finally, Winnebago. There were two Winnebago who were wounded at the Battle of Bella Wood in June of 1918. Okay. Now, a newspaper article said that they were code talkers. We don't know if they were, but this newspaper article said that they were. If they were, then they would be the earliest ones. They would be even earlier than the Cherokee, who were October 8th, 1918. This is June of 1918. But again, we don't know for certain that they were code talkers. We do know that two Winnebago were indeed wounded in battle. Okay, so now we're done with World War I, and it might surprise you to know that even though this was successful or appeared to be successful, the U.S. military was not entirely sold on the use of code talking for future wars, and in this case, World War II. First of all, let me mention the official German reaction. Hey, what did the Germans say about the use of code talkers against them in World War I? They didn't say anything. We don't have any records of it. This isn't all that surprising in a way, because this was done at the very end of the war, and there's just a little bit of a sample that they could look at. So they really didn't comment on it. Okay. But the U.S. military had some questions. They weren't entirely convinced that this was going to work. One of the problems was they felt that these languages would be compromised in a future conflict. In other words, a future adversary would more than likely try and learn these languages, so that edge would go away. So that raises the question, was that true? Did it actually happen? Was their fear legitimate? Yes and no. We know that these languages were learned by future adversaries, during the 1920s and 1930s. But none of it was for national security reasons. It was purely academic. What am I talking about? We know that there were Japanese who worked on the reservations, between the wars. They were hired, or they worked for Native American organizations. They were certainly exposed to these languages. The Germans are renowned for linguistics. And we know that there was some academic work done by certain Germans, but again, there was no connection to national security. Let me give you a couple of examples. Edward Sapir, a name that I suspect you've never heard before, Sapir. He was one of the leading experts in the world on the German, or on the Navajo texts, on the Navajo language. Fortunately for us, he was a German American. He was not actually in Germany during World War II. Another man, Gunther Wagner, and I'm sure I'm getting his name, I'm pronouncing his name wrong, was an expert on the Comanche language. He worked for propaganda for the Germans during World War II. So as far as we know, the Germans never took advantage of his knowledge. The FBI never arrested anybody for learning these languages. Closest, I suppose, they came would have been Colin Ross, who was a Nazi filmmaker who tried to go onto the Native American reservations and make films, but he was turned down because he was just too connected to the Nazis. Okay, before we move on, I just want to talk very briefly about the Germans, their interest in Native Americans and their fascination with the Old West. Karl May was a 19th century German author. He was the German version, I suppose, of Zane Grey or Louis L'Amour. He wrote novels about the Old West. He was very popular. And among his fans was Adolf Hitler. And Albert Einstein was another guy, who happened to like Karl May's writing. So basically, Germans everywhere just really, really liked his writings. Hitler himself was interested in the Native Americans. He was fascinated by them, and he actually considered them allying with them against, the U.S. government during World War II, something that they had tried in World War I with Mexico. It didn't work in World War I with Mexico, and it didn't work either. The Native American tribes, as far as we know, had no interest in working with Hitler at all. So that's a very interesting story there. All right, I'm going to go on to the next slide, and we're going to talk about World War II now. And the time period is 1939, 1945. The United States, of course, gets in the war in late 1941 after the attack on Pearl Harbor. 1942 is really when it goes into effect for us. Okay. And then the tribes you're looking at on the screen were used by the Army, not the Marine Corps. They used the Navajo. I'm going to talk about them separately. There were 33 tribes that were used, or the 33 code-talking tribes used by the Army. And I'm not going to go over all of them. I'm just going to mention a couple of them. Let's start with Meskwaki, which you can see there on the fourth line. The Meskwaki were actually the first code talkers. And they actually were, a couple of them were captured. They were used in North Africa, in the North African campaign. I also want to talk about Hopi, Hopi, which is on the next line. The Hopi were interesting because, as far as we know, they were the only code talkers, and they were one of the larger army groups that actually passed numbers. That's all they did. They passed numbers. Okay. Time out for a second. My cat just jumped on the, I have to grab my cat. I'm sorry.
Here he comes.
Sorry about that, folks. I'm back.
Well
You
done,
probably
Greg.
heard him. He made his presence known. What can I say? All right, it's time to continue on. The other one I want to mention is, again, we see the Lakota and the Sioux. The Sioux code talkers were known as MacArthur's boys. General MacArthur, he was fond of, or he liked using the Sioux code talkers in the Pacific. Now, there's one tribe that's not listed here that should raise some eyebrows, and that's the Cree, C-R-E-E, the Cree. The Cree were from Canada. They were not from the United States. They were used by the U.S. military, the U.S. Army, specifically our Air Forces, as code talkers during World War II. The Canadian government chose not to use them. And interestingly, Navajo, although it was primarily used by the Marines, was used a little bit by the Army. Now, was it just Native American tribes that we use for code talking purposes? Did it have to be? Not necessarily. There's some evidence, although it's somewhat weak, that we use Basque. Basque is this obscure language. It's spoken by the people, the Basque people who live on the French-Spanish border in the Pyrenees area. It's what's known as a language isolate. It's a very different language than the languages around it. The problem with Basque is that it was pretty well known by the Japanese because there were Basque missionaries all over the Pacific. We also considered but discounted Esperanto, which was this made-up language. The reason we didn't use Esperanto is because it was simply too well known. So that was the problem there. Okay, now all these tribes just use culture to come up with their terms, their made-up terms to match words that didn't exist in their language, but they didn't always agree. For example, the Comanche, who I'll talk about next, they used sewing machine for machine gun, sewing machine for machine gun, while the Navajo use a rapid fire gun. So there's some differences there. I also want to mention that even though these are Army tribes, the tribes that were used by the Army itself never completely bit off on code talking. They had some doubts about it. Now, they never officially forbade it, but they never really encouraged it either. It was one of these cases of go ahead and do it, but you're sort of on your own. You'll find documents where they discuss the use of code talkers, but you're not going to find very many, if any, that actually say, oh, yeah, we wholeheartedly support it. So this was essentially, in the case of the Army, a bottom to top movement. It started on the bottom, local initiative, and then went up. The Marine Corps will be the direct opposite because that came from the top down. All right, I'm going to go on to the next slide. Let's talk about the Comanche now. The Comanche are arguably the best known of the Army code talkers because they were used in the D-Day landings. Okay. There were 14 Comanche code talkers. There were actually 17, but only 14 deployed. And if you're doing the math here, if you're looking at the picture and counting them, you'll count 16. So one of them is not there for some reason. This is obviously before they deployed. Maybe he's the guy taking the picture. I don't know. Who can say? Hugh Foster, Lieutenant Hugh Foster, later on, he would become a brigadier general. He worked with them at Fort Benning, Georgia. And what he did was he came up with the military term, and he asked the Comanches to come up with an equivalent in their language. Eventually, they would come up with 250 words. It would be a 250-word dictionary. And let me give you examples of what they came up with. I already gave you one. Sewing machine is machine gun. Another one was big bird for colonel. Colonel, the military rank, because they have an eagle on their shoulder. So when the Comanche said big bird, they were talking about a colonel. A more interesting one is for bomber, the aircraft, the plane that drops bombs. They came up with pregnant catfish. They put some thought into this. Essentially, if you cut up a catfish, that's pregnant, you'll see a lot of eggs in it. And those are the bombs. So they could be pretty creative. Now, the Comanche also had a spell chart. And what am I talking about when I say a spell chart? I think most, if not all of us, are familiar with the military phonetic system, alpha, beta, Charlie, delta, echo, etc. Okay, well, it was the same type of thing. They had to come up with an equivalent to the letter A, the letter B, the letter C. So what they did was they simply found a word in their own language that matched the English. Say, for example, for the letter A, they would use apple. So they simply used the word for apple to spell out, to represent A. What the Comanche would do is that they would start, when they're about to spell something, they would start by simply saying, now listen to me, or now I spell. And then they would start with the apple, bear, cow, whatever they would use. They would spell it out. And one final point I want to make about the Comanche is that they committed these terms to memory. They memorized it. Now, you may think to yourself, wow, that's really amazing. They had to memorize 250 words. It wasn't as big of a deal to them as you might think. In a way, they had no choice because they really didn't have a written language, or at least not one that a lot of people knew. And they also had a strong oral tradition. Essentially, they were used to storytelling. So this was not, remembering things like this was not as difficult for them as you would think. In fact, they would, all the tribes would do this as far as I know. Certainly the Navajo did. All right, let me talk about that little notebook that you see there on the screen. You've been wondering what that is. It's the little green book is what it's called. And this was Lieutenant Foster's notebook. Foster is the guy that helped them develop their vocabulary. This was his notebook. He wrote down the terms. Now, he lost this book, believe it or not, in North Africa, and it was never recovered. Now, this could have been a disaster, but fortunately, the Comanche code talkers were not in North Africa. They were in France. So why are we looking at this notebook now? Foster, when he had the time, went back and basically did it all over again, basing it on his memory. So what you're looking at is the second version of his dictionary, and this is what you will find at the National Cryptologic Museum. It's on display. All right. I mentioned this earlier that the Comanche were in France. They were not in North Africa. They actually participated in the D-Day landings, June 1944, the Allied landings in France and elsewhere to liberate Europe from the Nazis. They were among the first to land, meaning that they also were among the first to pass a message. The person who's in the circle there, his name is Charles Chibitty, Chibitty. Depending on the source you're looking at, was the first person to actually send a message out in Comanche when the unit had landed. These were individuals that belonged to a unit led by Theodore Roosevelt Jr., who was a brigadier general, the son of the president, or the son of the former president. So they were his code talkers. And that first message that they sent out was fighting is fierce and we need help. That's one version of it. Another version was along the line of, we're here, or the fighting is, we're being attacked. We landed at the wrong place. We should be a little farther up the beach. That was that first message that was put out. Okay. Well, they landed in France, and they would go on to be among the first to liberate Paris, France, and all 14 of them returned home safe and sound. Now I'm going to talk about the Navajo, and this is I'll spend most of my time on them. They're the most famous. Why are they the most famous? Well, 2 movies have been made about them, and no movies have been made about the other code talkers. One of the movies you've probably have heard of, it's fairly recent, called Wind Talkers from the year 2002. Another movie is from 1955, Battle Cry. I'll talk about that one later on. So movies have been made about them. They were used only by the Marine Corps. The Marines didn't use anyone else but Navajo. As I showed you earlier, the Army used a whole bunch of different tribes, and they also used the Navajo. But the Marines didn't use anyone but Navajo. And also, there were 450 Navajo code talkers, actually 450 plus. There were by far more Navajo code talkers than there were code talkers of the other tribes combined. So that's why they're so well known. And because there were so many of them, there was a program in place. When one went down, another one followed. They had a system in place, ongoing training. That never really happened with the other tribes. Okay, so how did this come about? The man on the right, his name is Philip Johnston. You can see his name there on the screen. He was a former Marine, and he also happened to know Navajo. He grew up on the Navajo reservation. And I don't know how he knew this, but he was aware that we had used code talkers in World War I. So now we're in World War II, the attack on Pearl Harbor, we're now at war. Shortly thereafter, he approaches the Marine Corps and he pitches the idea of using Navajo as a code-talking language. He thought it would work because it was such a difficult language. Okay, he was certainly right on that, but he was wrong in another area. He thought that the language was unknown, that there were no dictionaries or anything written in Navajo. In fact, the Franciscan missionaries had developed a Navajo dictionary. Now, this was not necessarily well known, but there were dictionaries out there that had Navajo. Anyhow, he was convinced it would work, so he pitched it to the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps was reluctant because they had heard the stories. They were afraid that this was an accident waiting to happen. A lot of things could go wrong. What he specifically did was he went to Camp Elliott in San Diego. And he visited with the signal officer there, a Lieutenant Colonel Jones, and he pitched it to Jones. Now, Lieutenant Colonel Jones was reluctant, but Johnston was able to convince him that his idea had some merit. How did he do this? What he did was he said a word in Navajo, and he asked Jones to repeat it. Jones was physically unable to repeat the sound. That impressed Jones to such a point that he said, maybe we've got something here. The end result was that a trial run was done. Johnston returned a few weeks later with 5 Navajo and put on a trial demonstration. This time there was a Marine general. His name was Vogel, V-O-G-E-L. He was there. And Johnston and his Marine and his Navajo team impressed Vogel so much that Vogel said, okay, we've got something here. And he convinced Marine headquarters to establish an actual program. So that's how that started. Johnston, by the way, tried to do the same thing to the Army. He went to the Army and told them about the Navajo. The Army was not interested. The Navy or the Marines were, the Army was not. All right, let's go on to the next slide. This is the original 29 Navajo code talkers. And I said before, there were over 450 of them. They had to be between the ages of 18 and 30. Not surprisingly, they had to be fluent in English and Navajo, in both languages. I want to emphasize, though, that they also had to become Marines. They had to make it through Marine basic training. They were not just code talkers, they were actual Marines. That's important to keep in mind. On to the next slide. I mentioned Lieutenant Foster and how he worked with the Comanches on establishing a code system. That really didn't happen with the Navajo. They were pretty much on their own. As you can see, they're in this room here, working on their own. Now, they were given a brief, and I want to emphasize brief lesson in code making. They were told 4 things. Number 1, you needed a spell chart because you're going to have to spell things out. Number 2, the coded words can only have one meaning, only one meaning. There should be no confusion at all. The meaning has got to be crystal clear to everyone. Number 3, the shorter the word, the better. And number 4, memory. They were to memorize them all, that oral tradition that I talked about. So it wasn't just the Comanche that had to memorize as well. It was the Navajo. And I believe the other tribes did this. Okay, so they came up originally with 237 terms and 26 letters, the equivalence of 26 letters. In the case of the letter A, for example, they didn't have a word in their language that they could use, so they used the word ant, A-N-T, the insect. So the Navajo word for ant was their A. By the end of the war, they had a grand total of 673 words, and 63 letters were now accounted for. This should raise a question. There are only 26 letters in the alphabet, so where do the 63 letters come from? Well, this is the punctuation, commas, spaces, things like that. They had to be accounted for as well. So what kind of words did they come up with? Well, again, culture came into play. Let me give you one, and then we'll have a little fun in the next slide. For the word fighter aircraft, or the military term fighter aircraft, they used hummingbird. The little bird, flying around in this kind of cute little motion. That's a hummingbird. All right, let's go on to the next slide. And here, I guess you're going to have to call this is the interactive part of this presentation. I want to give you about a minute or so to write down what you think these are. We're looking for the military term. Some of these are easier than others. I'll give you about a minute or so to do this. I'll take a drink of water, and then we'll get started. I'm not going to ask for answers because I don't think we're set up for that. I'll simply tell you what they are, and you can see for yourself how well you did. So I'm going to use this opportunity to take a drink of water. Okay, I don't want to take a lot of time on this. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. So you're probably going to get some. You may not get all of them. A couple of these are pretty interesting. I'm just going to take them one at a time and try and look at it from their perspective, why they came up with these. Okay, a tortoise is a tank. T-A-N-K. It makes sense if you stop and think about it. The armor, slow moving. A whale is a battleship. A whale is a battleship. A potato is a hand grenade. Oh, and I want to clarify too, these are Navajo code talking terms. The slide says Native American code talkers, but these are Navajo. Ironfish is submarine. Now I'll get to chicken hawk in a minute. Owl is a reconnaissance aircraft, a night plane, which makes sense. Owls fly at night. Many shelters is a village or a town. Running water is a river. Sea soldier, not too tough, is a sailor. Okay, now I want to talk about the two I skipped. Chicken hawk is a dive bomber. Chicken hawks swoop down on their prey, and that's what dive bombers do. They swoop down and they fire, their torpedo missiles or whatever it is they fire. And the other one here is really kind of cute. It's bulldozer for bull sleep. They didn't have a word for bulldozer, so they came up with bull sleep bulldozing. End result, bulldozer. Okay, so that's kind of fun. What we're looking at now is an actual Navajo message. On the left is the message, and then on the right is what the Navajo did with it. And of course, it's in English, it's not in Navajo. So I'm going to go over this just quickly and explain to you how this works. And I think you can see where they had to make up words. Request artillery is asked for many big guns. Okay, that part is pretty clear. Okay, and Navajo had a word for and. Tank is tortoise. Fire, they had the word fire. They had the word at. They had 1, 2, 3. They had the numbers. Now the bear is the equivalent of bee. That's that made up word. Now comma is a tail drop. An animal drops its tail. What does a comma look like when you write it? So that's where that comes from. Company is Mexican. I don't know how they came up with that, but it's very interesting. E is ear. Now they're spelling out move. Mouse, owl, Victor, ear with the first letters. 50 yards, left flank. They have those words in Navajo. Owl, fox is of. And then there's that company, again, Mexican and D for deer. So this is what a typical Navajo message would have looked like. Okay, reality check. I'm going to tell you something that is going to surprise you. The codes that were made were actually not that good. Right? Usually when people who aren't trained as code makers make codes, it can be disastrous. And remember, they really weren't trained. They were pretty much making it up. For example, in the Vietnam War, when we had instances where we were making up codes locally and they didn't work very well for us. And the military knew this, and this is one of the reasons. This helps explain why there was some reluctance to adopt the system, because they were violating the rules of good code making. Said another way, we were lucky. Okay. For code breaking, you need sustained collection, databases. You need to accumulate databases. That's how you break codes. And I'm of the opinion, at least, that eventually, had the war gone on longer, that some of these codes would have been compromised. Now, what made the system so doggone good was the difficulties of the language. Navajo was particularly problematic. According to the Japanese, it sounded like someone speaking underwater, if you can get a mental picture of that. Okay. The Japanese, from a language perspective, and I think some of us know this, have problems pronouncing some English, sounds. Like, for example, the L and the R were a problem for them. And one of the things that we did was we used the word lollipop for passwords. So anyone getting on the telephone would have to prove he's an American because he can effectively say lollipop. One of the really neat things that the code talkers did, his name was Charles Whitepipe. He was a Lakota code talker. He would perform some self-authentication. Whenever he got on the radio or the telephone, whatever it was he was using, he would start a conversation on the other end to make sure that the person he was speaking with was legitimate. He would ask him a couple questions, ask him about reservation life, etc. Then he would start into his message once he was convinced the person he was dealing with was legitimate. I don't know if you could always do that, but that was a pretty effective way. Now, from a linguistic perspective, the problem here is one of parsing. You don't know where the word ends and where it starts. Where is the subject? Where is the verb? Where is the the noun, that kind of stuff. It wasn't all that clear. It was hard to break the sentence up. So it was very, very difficult to transcribe or to imitate. Okay, here's a little more clarity about what I'm talking about, the problems that Navajo had. There were too few code words, and they never changed them. And these are all things that are bad in terms of making codes, cryptography, the code making, or the code writing course 101. Okay, there were too few code words. Now, there were 673 Navajo codes, but believe it or not, there were coded words. But believe it or not, this was not enough, or was not considered enough. As an example, in World War II, we broke the Japanese JN-25 code, which helped us win the Battle of Midway. That had over 27,000 entries. So the more, the better. Now, the Navajo did add words. They added words like beach, beach, cave, words that, that they needed as the war went on. They didn't have them originally, but they never changed the original ones. In other words, tortoise would remain tortoise throughout, and that's not good. Nor did they change the alphabetic equivalent. A would always be ant. And again, that's not good. There was too much predictability. It was too easy to guess the meaning. With a little bit of context, you could figure out that a tortoise crossing the road was a tank. That wasn't much of a stretch. So those are the kind of problems you had. Too much English was used. And also, the fact that Navajo was changed so that we made it more like English actually made it weaker. Pure Navajo was much more secure. Now, that having been said, or in all fairness, what they came up with is about the best you could have expected given the circumstances. And of course, it was good enough, as we know, because as far as we know, our adversaries never understood what these guys were saying. All right. There were 29 originally, 27 of them deployed. They went to Guadalcanal, which was the first battle in 1942 for the Marine Corps with the Native American code talkers. 2 of them stayed behind as trainers. Okay. All 6 divisions in the Pacific had Navajo code talkers, and they participated in every Marine assault from 1942 to 1945, except for the Battle of Tarawa. Why they were not at Tarawa, I don't know. My assumption is they simply weren't available. They were especially valuable at the Battle of Iwo Jima, which was in early 1945. Some of us are familiar with the famous raising of the flag on Mount Suribachi at Iwo Jima. Well, that was first reported by the Navajo code talkers. Okay, the Navajo had to constantly prove their mettle. They had to constantly prove they were better than others. When they first arrived on Guadalcanal, the signal officer there, Lieutenant Hunt, didn't know who they were. Who are these guys? So they had to demonstrate to him that they were legitimate. Okay. Interestingly, our own Navy, which had all these successes against Japan, I mentioned JN-25 is just one example, were unable to break the Navajo code talker system. All right, now I want to talk about the myth of capture. And this was perpetuated by the movie Wind Talkers, where they had a scene in it where, or they forth the idea that we would kill the code talkers, the Navajo code talkers, to prevent them from being captured by the Japanese. The thought was that they're so important that we can't afford to lose these guys, so they would be killed to prevent capture and torture. That simply is not true. That is Hollywood. It was never our policy to kill a code talker to prevent them from being captured. If you remember what I said much earlier in the presentation, there were Meskwaki that were captured. They were the first code talkers. We anticipated the loss of codes or compromise of codes. And when that happened, we simply changed the code. it was never our policy to kill a code talker to save the code. It was not necessary. Now, that having been said, there was an instance, and this was not the Navajo, this was actually the Lakota. And this happened in the Philippine Islands. The general was Paul Mueller, I believe it was the 81st Division. He put out the word that should his unit be overrun, he was to be killed along with his Lakota code talker. The reasoning behind this, at least logically, was it was because of the information they knew. It wasn't to protect the Lakota code talking code. Mueller didn't know it himself. Now, the Navajo did have they did have bodyguards. They did have personal protection. They were protected, obviously, from the Japanese. But they also were protected from us. We didn't know who they were. The Japanese were notorious for infiltration, putting on Marine uniforms and trying to, enter our lines and cause havoc. The average GI, the average soldier, American, had never seen a Japanese before, and depending on where they were from, they may or may not have seen a Native American. There's a physical similarity. So it wasn't a stretch for them to believe that, a Navajo was actually Japanese. Okay, so they had guards to protect them from us. We do know that when the Navajo got on the radio and started passing messages, we would jam their messages because we thought they were Japanese. As a way of preventing this, what the Navajo would do is they would often start off by saying Arizona or New Mexico, tipping off that, I'm going to start speaking English now. Now, this was bad security, but it became necessary. There were duress words to prevent, if a Navajo was going to be captured, there were words that he could use to prevent it. But as I said before, no Navajo were ever captured. No Navajo code talkers were ever captured in World War II. Now, there were Navajo code talkers that were killed. And there were also Navajos that were captured, but they were not code talkers. However, there was breaches of security, which unfortunately happened in the United States of all places where it should have been prevented. And Philip Johnston, the man that sold the Marine Corps on the idea of the code talkers in the first place, was responsible for one incident. What happened was that the Navajo family members, they had not heard from their sons, their spouses, whoever, for a long time. So they wondered, how come I'm not getting letters from them? So they contacted the Navajo Affairs superintendent and asked them what's up. The superintendent asked Johnston about it. Johnston told them they were doing top secret work using their language, which was a no-no. This was reported. Now, nothing happened from it, but it could have been a disaster. And there were other instances of this that happened in World War II. Another example of this was Ernie Pyle, the famous war correspondent. He reported from Okinawa that there not only were Navajo code talkers, he mentioned their names, for the family back home. So certainly the Japanese knew there were code talkers, Native American code talkers, and they probably knew they were Navajo. Okay. Their records were destroyed. We really don't know this for certain, but, simple logic. For the record, or as an FYI, the Japanese Army was much better at code breaking than the Japanese Navy. Fortunately for us, they really didn't cooperate. They were suspicious of each other, and that was good for us. All right. Now, there was no known case of success against the enemy, as I said before, against these code talkers. And we would use it in Japan after the war as part of the occupation. In the next war that followed, Korea, 1950 to 1953, it was not used. Chester Nez, the most famous of the Navajo code talkers, actually volunteered to be a code talker, but he was told no. It was not used in Vietnam either. And by the way, if anyone out there knows of code talking being used by us in Vietnam, I'd like to know about it because I'm researching it. We know of no evidence that ever happened. The oddity here is that even though this works so well, we never used it again. And I can say this because there's no records of it. The reservations who would know certainly if it was used later on, have no records that it's ever been used. So this might seem kind of strange. Okay, the best answer that I have for this is that the Marine Corps decided that it was pretty much a one and done. It worked well for us, but let's move on to something else. They believed that there were more sophisticated crypto systems that could provide a voice security better. And keep in mind, this could be used against us. Now, and the military did studies after the war, and there were pros and cons, but they basically just decided we're not going to use this anymore. Is it still being used today? Yes, although not by us. During the 1954 Battle of Dien Bien Phu, when France was fighting in Vietnam before we got there, French used various Arabic languages as well as English against the Vietnamese. In the 1973 Yom Kippur War, the Egyptians used Nubian, which was a language from Sudan. And as late as 1979, when China fought Vietnam, they used the Wenzhou dialect. All right, and I'm finishing up here. I want to talk about recognition. The Marine Corps declassified the Navajo program in 1968. The Army, oddly enough, never really classified the use of these languages. You'll find documents going back and forth on it. The reason for this is because they never officially bid off on it in the first place. It came from the top, it came from the bottom up. Now, the Marines are interesting here because way back in 1955, there was a movie called Battle Cry, 1955, and it was based on a book by Leon Uris, URIS, who had been who had fought with the Marines, and he fought with, he fought with units that had Navajo code talkers. He wrote about the Navajo in the book. He never said they were code talkers. But when the movie was made, all of a sudden they became code talkers, and the Marines blessed it. They were all enthusiastic about the movie. So it was really an open secret that we used Navajo code talkers in World War II. It was officially declassified in 1968. In July of 2001, the Navajo received congressional medals for meritorious service. And then the movie Wind Talkers came out the next year. Following year, in June of 2002, Congress passed the Code Talkers Recognition Act. The other tribes were unhappy because they weren't getting any recognition. It all went to the Navajo. So in 2002, this Code Talkers Recognition Act was passed to acknowledge the contribution of the other tribes as well. And in the year 2013, the NSA Cryptologic Hall of Honor inducted the Code Talkers in the year 2013 as a collective entry. Finally, I want to acknowledge Dr. Steve Huffman, Huffman, who's the real expert on this topic. He knows more about this than anybody that I know. He's researched all kinds of areas of it. He's the expert on it. I used his notes for this presentation. I corresponded with him, and I'm proud to say I actually was able to provide a couple of things to him he didn't know. But I want to acknowledge him. Okay, you see the reference to the National Cryptologic Museum. Again, this is their presentation. There's the contact information for them. There's me at the bottom. And in the middle there is information on getting historical publications from NSA, www.nsa.gov. These are free of charge. You can download some of them, or you can contact our publications office, the Center for Cryptologic History, and ask them. And we're obligated by law to provide them to you. They're yours free because you're the American public. We don't have anything in the Code Talkers, though, at least as far as I know. Okay, I don't know how I did on time, but I am finished, and I'm looking forward to the questions. Thank you for your time.
Well, we thank you very much, Greg. We will go side by side, and I'll present a couple questions for you, okay?
Sure.
If everybody wants to, and if you want to stop sharing, then we can go ahead. And
Okay.
if everybody's got these, and they'll be
Yeah.
able to have the recording will be sent to them. So the people that are not with us this evening and those that are with us and would like to review the recording. So thank you for this very excellent presentation.
Mm.
And you had mentioned that you had presented this for the FBI as well. What a
Right.
wonderful what a wonderful legacy for them to look back on and see some of the heritage that has come forth, right? Uh, I think
I
they
apologize about the
enjoyed
cat, by the way. He just jumped up and he
it.
knocked something over and I had to do something. It's
That's not
I shouldn't have let him into the room in the first place.
not an
But
issue.
others will understand that.
Well, I would like to thank you for also for going through all of the different tribes and all of the native peoples who had all contributed to that. As you said, a lot of times in Navajo, we're the only ones getting the recognition. So thank you for expanding upon that. We've got our first question I'll bring to you by Joanne. Thanks, Joanne. Would code talking still be effective today with the advent of AI?
Okay, yes. Yes, but I would say mostly no. It can be used, remember, it can be used against us. I mean, it certainly is a novelty. And I think it probably would work right away, but I think eventually an adversary would catch on to it very quickly. So, after World War II, as I said before, it really wasn't used anymore. The US military didn't want to use it anymore. They kind of knew, that, let's not push our luck here. So I would tend to say not so much. You might be able to get away with it for a little while, but I
Mhm.
don't think it would last. It would be that effective in the long run. And this is just one man's opinion. People that know more about this would are free to disagree.
Gotcha. Very good. Thank you. Connie or John want to know, was the Nazi swastika designed from a Navajo symbol? We've heard that before. And I understood that Hitler was fond of the Navajo symbols. As you mentioned, he was um, interested in Native American peoples.
Yes, as far as I know, that did not come from the Native Americans. I always thought the Nazi swastika came from the country of India. Now, I might be wrong on that. Now, I know that in the American Southwest, there are some symbols there that I believe there's some kind of symbolism here that the Nazis liked, but I don't think the swastika came from them. I might be wrong. I'm not going to be an expert on that. Hitler was fascinated by the Native Americans. He I read somewhere that he actually considered them a form of to be Aryans, Aryan.
Hmm.
And I don't know, who can understand why he thinks what he thought, but
Yeah.
that's one of the things that I stumble across in my research.
Yeah, that is such a surprising factoid there, isn't it? I mean, that's something that I don't think any of us would have really thought about in considering his thoughts of other people other than Aryans.
Yeah, he liked the Native Americans. He was a big fan of Karl May.
Very
And
interesting.
again, Albert Einstein, of course, who had nothing to do with the Nazis and Hitler, of course, was another fan of Karl May. He was very popular,
Yeah.
throughout all of Germany. He created this fictional character. His name was Winnetou, Winnetou, who was an Apache chief, sort of based on Geronimo. That was a Karl May creation. You can look up Karl May. His last name is May and then Karl, if you've never heard of him. And I
Yeah.
suspect a lot of people have not.
I think you're absolutely right on that one. Well, let's go into the next one. Jackson wants to know, are there any records of our enemies attempting to decode the coded messages? Do we know that Japanese were they decoding? Were the Germans decoding anything on the other side?
Hey, we don't know that much about it. Now. And the Japanese were very, very good at destroying their records, much better than the Germans. So we don't really know what the Japanese thought about the code talkers outside of simple logic. We do know that they, based on, the POWs that we talked to, their own cryptologists, they certainly were aware that Native Americans were being used, but we don't know just how effective they were in breaking these messages. One of the reasons we can say they never broke any of these messages because we have no evidence of it. In the case of the Germans, there's a little bit more documentation. The Germans have a lot of documentation on the Soviet. They fought the Soviets, and the Soviets use a number of languages. Uh, I don't remember seeing anything about the Germans, commenting on the use of code talking used against them. Now we know that some of them were captured. Rommel in North Africa captured two Meskwaki code talkers. So they were certainly aware that we had code talkers. I don't know if that answers the question.
I think I think it absolutely does. Thank you very much. Joanne, well, let's see if we've got another one down here. I think Joanne meant that might have been a clarification of those. Just wanted to modify your question. Gotcha. We were talking about AI there. I want to bring up World War One when you talked about the Battle of the Somme. I don't think people understand, may or may not know that. I mean, we're talking about 400 to 500,000 casualties in some of these
Right.
battles. These were not insignificant things. So any kind of input and any degree of secrecy in that battle and those, and especially in the Argonne as well, had huge impact. And the secrecy, can you address the import of it in a battle of that size?
Okay, well, the Battle of Somme, and this was actually, begun in 1916. I think there was more than one Battle of Somme. The one
Yeah.
I'm referring to was later. But the big one in 1916 was one of the bloodiest battles you're ever going to run into. And it's the first time that tanks were actually used. The British introduced tanks. But in World War One, I mean, it was just a slaughterhouse. I mean, just people talk about the Civil War and some of the battles there, the massive killing, battles like Antietam and even Gettysburg. In World War One, I mean, these the ways of killing were worse because you had machine guns. You didn't have this in in the Civil War. And you
Or the
had
gas.
poison gas and tanks and aircraft and just ways of killing was just they really maximized it. So yeah, security absolutely mattered. And the Americans were amateurs for the most part. We came to the war late
Yeah.
because, the war began in 1914 and we didn't get there until 1917. So when we got there, the British and the French were on our side and we had to rely on them a lot. And they told us things and we didn't necessarily believe them. We had to learn the hard way. But our communication systems were very poor, and we recognize that. So we came up with code talking as a solution, and it seemed to work at the very end. Too
Yeah.
bad we didn't use it earlier.
Absolutely. Can you tell us about the ranks of any of these code talkers? What ranks were they within the military, and did they were there promotions within their ranks?
That's a really good question. Based on my research, none of them, there were no officers. The highest any of them ever got was sergeant. And it wasn't, which is, relatively high within the enlisted system. None of them were senior sergeants, senior enlisted. And the reason for that is because most of them didn't stay. I mean, they were there to do their job and then they left. Now, in terms of battlefield promotions and things like that, you would think that some of them would have shined enough to get battlefield promotions, on the spot. I know of no evidence of that ever happening, but none of those guys had very high rank.
Okay,
And that's a very interesting question. You wonder, why
that was
some of them were not promoted over others. This
absolutely
is an
that.
area that I don't know that much about. Based on my research, at least,
No, thank you for
they
that. That
pretty
was that.
much went to unrecognized.
Yeah, I can understand that. The Cree, you said that was being used from Canada, and that was used in
Yes.
North Africa, correct? Well,
The Pacific,
the
the
Pacific.
Pacific
Okay,
by
in
the
the
Army
Pacific.
Air Corps.
By the Army Air Corps. Okay, great.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, that's what my dad was, Army Air Corps in World War II. And he talked about some of the different languages that were being used well before all of
Really?
this came up, a long, long, long time
Yeah.
and they had Native American within my family historically. They would bring that up that they had knew somebody who was part of that. I've got to say, I absolutely loved your wonderful visual with the tortoise and the tanks and such.
Oh,
I
yeah.
did
Well, it
that
wasn't mine. It was
well. Yes,
the National Archaeological Museum. I want
it
to
was
mention
there.
something. I need to clarify this.
Good.
Not all Native Americans were code talkers. And that's important to keep in mind. A lot of them weren't. For example, Ira Hayes, he was one of those involved in the raising of the flag at Mount Suribachi.
Yes.
He was, I believe I don't think he was Navajo. but he was a Native American and he was not a code talker. So just because you were a Native American, that doesn't make you a code talker. So
Absolutely.
that's important to keep in mind. Not all Native Americans were code talkers. And it's an easy assumption to make, but it's simply not true.
Absolutely, absolutely. Somebody was also mentioning, what does the sea soldier mean? I believe that was a sailor, correct?
Sailor, right. Yeah,
Yeah,
I went through that kind of fast.
no, I
I
think that
thought
was
those are
absolutely
pretty
great. Yeah.
easy, except for the chicken hawk and the bulldozer. I
No,
thought those would be
right.
harder,
And my dad
or the
was,
bulldozing.
a reconnaissance aircraft in Army Air Corps, so he was an owl. So I like
Right,
that.
okay.
I wanted to, you mentioned some of the breakdowns, like the needs for changing more frequently. So that's what's progressed, I guess, was the success of the Enigma machine, because that's changing all the time. That was changing all the time, or a good bit. Is that where you see something changing, how they had an advancement in the German side?
Okay, that's entirely different. The
Okay,
Enigma machine is a machine-generated
right,
cipher.
right.
And essentially what you do is you press a key and another key lights up. It creates randomness. The Navajo and the code talkers had nothing at all like that. With the possible exception, I mentioned this of the Hopi, who had numbers. And those numbers are put on codes, making that a cipher. That would have made something much more secure. But the the Enigma machine was just a much more complicated system, and we didn't, of course, use Enigma machines. We had our own machines, and some were better than others. A lot of them were uh, breakable over a certain amount of time. But
Yeah,
yeah, there's a big difference between the Enigma machine and what the code talkers tried to do. And again, it was so successful. I mean, again, maybe
thank
we'll learn someday that these messages were broken by somebody, but I have my doubts.
Well, it sounds like it was an absolutely invaluable contribution by all the Native Americans to contribute, and I know that they were very proud of this legacy that they have done. And so wonderful that you announced the awards that were given to them in 2001, 2002, and 2013. It's nice that
Right, very well
recognition.
deserved.
Well deserved, long time in coming, and I thank you for bringing this. This is a wonderful talk, both about history, about diversity, and about the contributions that the Native American tribes have made during our different world wars. So, thank you for this presentation. I think we've gotten to most all the questions. I think maybe there's a new one in there. Ah,
Yeah, and someone, you can always contact me too.
and
I,
Julia, you're
it is a
asking about the
topic I know a fair amount about. I've
very
learned an awful lot, reading Steve Huffman's notes and talking with him and doing my own research. Because I talk about them at the museum too. So I'm well versed in terms of, what we have available to the public on that. I'm sorry, we're gonna bring up a
No,
question.
it was Julia asking about the Enigma machine, and we'll talk about that another time. We will talk about the Enigma machine another time, but thank you very much again, Gregory Nedved, for this wonderful
Yeah,
presentation.
you're welcome.
We enjoyed it and we learned an awful lot. Everything you said was surprising to us. Um,
Yeah, there's a few surprises there. I'll admit
there
that,
are,
things
there
you
are.
wouldn't expect.
Absolutely, absolutely. It was extremely engaging. I've got 6 pages of notes to share with people.
Okay.
Thank
Yeah,
you all for
and
joining us,
yeah,
and thank everybody out there in the audience for joining
yeah.
us. If you'd like to learn more, go to our website, follow Greg's suggestions, and we hope to see you next time when we'll be back with learning a little bit about Lord Dunmore's War. So thank you very much, and good night, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night, Greg, and we thank you.